So good morning to everybody in Asia Pacific region. I am honored and humbled to be here this evening presenting to you on the whole issue of human trafficking. And when I heard Michelle introduce herself, I remembered back, is it 40 years ago, when Michelle Lopez introduced me to this whole issue in Pattaya in Bangkok, outside of Bangkok. So I am excited to be with you all, and I'm going to share screen so that you can follow with the PowerPoint. And I will stop, as Teresa said, more or less 3 times in the presentation. And if there is any specific question, any point for clarification, please feel free to say it, to voice it. And maybe we will hear a number of questions rather than answering each question each time. So we might take 4 or 5 comments, questions, and then we'll see how to answer them. So with that, I will launch, I hope, the screen share. So we're going to talk this evening about our position paper on trafficking of women and girls. So welcome again. And some of what I'm going to say, you may hear something similar to what I said the last time when we talked about migration. So here we're talking about the purpose of the webinars. And for this particular webinar, we are hoping to unpack this position paper on trafficking of women and girls, so as to increase our capacity to understand the persistent and complex dynamics of trafficking. So that we can understand how persistent it is and how complex. And hopefully from that, you will see on the PowerPoint that I have paragraph 3, lines 8 and 9. And when you go back on the PowerPoint, you'll be able to see where I referenced the position paper. So I think this might help you to link the PowerPoint and the position paper. I'm not going to say this every time, but now you know that it's there. So unpacking the paper, and then this leading to a deeper understanding of systemic advocacy by analyzing the root causes. And then having done that, then how can we integrate this new knowledge into our Good Shepherd programs and into our advocacy work. And before I leave this particular slide, I am going to recommend to you very highly this book, which is titled Inherent Dignity. It's an advocacy guidebook. And really, if you want to just focus on one area, the link to the book is here in the PowerPoint, so you have access to it. And it outlines in more detail some of what I will cover this evening. So the last time we began with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and seeing that we work from a human rights framework, it's only right and proper to recall the opening words of the Universal Declaration. And it says, whereas recognition of the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family, it is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. Inherent dignity. This is the foundation for Good Shepherd position paper on human trafficking, and also the foundation for all of our ministries and all advocacy that we undertake on behalf of persons who have been trafficked. The inherent dignity of the person, and that everybody has equal and inalienable rights as members of the human family. And I'm going to elaborate a little bit here in terms of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. There are 30 articles in all, outlining 30 rights. And I have just noted some of them, that when these rights are violated, people are vulnerable to being trafficked. So the right to life, the right not to be a slave, and the number after refers to the particular article. So Article 4, the right not to be a slave, not to be tortured, the right to move, the right to seek a place to live, a safe place to live, right to a nationality, right to social security, workers' rights, the right to food and shelter, including medical care, and the right to education. As I say, I picked out some of these particular ones, and I'm saying these rights can be violated over the course of a person's life. Human trafficking is not a random act. It's not just something that happens. Rather, it happens because of the vulnerability to being trafficked. And this vulnerability to being trafficked happens, as I see it, over the course of a person's life, beginning really with birth. Because if a person, a baby born, doesn't have food and shelter and medical care, they're already rendered vulnerable. And then this violation of human rights, it's cumulative over the years. It builds up. And it has a very disempowering effect on people. And we find some of that echoed in paragraph 2 of the position paper. I'm not going to delay here. It's the Inherent Dignity, the Advocacy Guidebook, which I recommend. And we are starting this from the recognition that human trafficking is a crime. And this crime defies human rights and is an affront to human dignity. Again, taken from the position paper. But human trafficking is a crime. And the position paper invites us to listen to survivors. And it would be marvelous if we had a whole morning to give you time to hear the story of a survivor and to track how the person's human rights were violated from birth right up to the point of being trafficked. And then how their rights are violated after being trafficked. And I suggest that you go to the book which I had mentioned there, Inherent Dignity, and you go to pages 27 and 28, and you have there the story of Kathy and her experience of being trafficked. And the link is on the website, the link is on the PowerPoint, so that it's easy for you to reference. So I want you to try and capture something of what are the human rights violations and how the person has been made vulnerable before the trafficking ever happened. And I'm sure many of you, from your experience in ministry throughout all of Asia Pacific, that you know this already. You know it, and you're experiencing it every other day in your work. Now, I want to draw attention to, we all, I think, know of CEDAW, which is the Convention to Eliminate Discrimination Against Women. And they very recently had a general recommendation. They did a draft on trafficking in women and girls in the context of global migration. And they just took one article out of the CEDAW Convention. And they wrote 33 pages on it. And again, the link is there And I'm encouraging you to go to that document. And in the light of what you hear this evening, see what you make out of that document. Now, I'm very happy to say that many people have contributed their views to this 33-page document, including your very own Global Shepherds, ACRAT from Australia, the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women from Australia, ourselves here at the GSIJP office. And when we did that, and I'm highlighting it because you in Asia were amplifying your voice, analysing legal and social issues in collaboration with the Justice Peace Office. And as I say, I think this is the high moment in our advocacy work, to be able to have our voice, our opinions posted on the public website in Geneva with regard to human rights. I just want you to note that many countries made comments and other NGOs, but I did note that not one of the governments from Asia did so. So you might want to just keep that in mind. And I'm taking out paragraph 22 out of that general recommendation, because it highlights for us this violation of human rights. And I'm going to read it slowly, and you can listen to the words and kind of think, do I understand what's being said here? It says women, and I would be inclined to write women and girls, are at risk of being trafficked and are more, so women at risk of being trafficked are more likely to be impoverished, uneducated, unemployed, and are disempowered by political, economic, societal, and family structures, including being subjected to unequal treatment, carrying the burden of household and childcare responsibilities, and are often subject to domestic violence. Facing such circumstances, some women and girls who often lack access to sustainable livelihoods or have no access to information on trafficking and how traffickers operate are susceptible to being lured by promises of a means of escape from impoverished circumstances. So we have poverty, lack of education, unemployment, being disempowered. And somebody comes along and says, you know, I can offer you education, a good job, and I can get you a passport, and we'll get you a ticket to go wherever you want or wherever we think we can help you. And the person is vulnerable at that point to being lured by a promise. And the paragraph continues, and I highlight this because it takes up exactly what we're saying in the position paper in paragraph 4, and I actually saying line 9. It says there are additional push factors, including persisting norms and stereotypes regarding male domination, and the need to assert male control or power and enforce gender roles. Male sexual entitlement, coercion, and control. And it's these aspects that drive the demand for the gender stereotyped exploitation of trafficking victims, as well as the lure of massive financial gains with few risks due to impunity enjoyed by the perpetrators. So we're saying basically gender inequality is a huge factor. And the whole male dominance, patriarchy, all of this domestic violence, this drives the whole issue of vulnerability. And then, of course, the people are vulnerable and the traffickers can make financial gains, earn money, make big profit, and with little risk. And I'll point that out to you because there's very little prosecutions. So I'm going to stop there now and see if anybody has any questions.
If anyone has any questions, just say your name and your question. Winifred, at this point, they are all right. Shall we continue?
We shall continue. I know it's difficult when you're trying to follow the PowerPoint and then to be trying to think of questions. But then sometimes if we wait to the very end, you might have forgotten what it was that you'd like to say. Oh, would you go back to slide 3 or 2? Or what did you mean by this word? So it doesn't matter how simple or how complex the question is. What's important is to hear it. Because if you have a question, I can guarantee you that 3 or 4 or 5 or 10 other people on this webinar have the same question. So you be the courageous one. Okay, so we're going to move now to looking at the international law. And I say this because I've already said to you, human trafficking is a crime. And there is an international law to address this. And it's the United Nations Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime. This is the main international instrument to fight against organized crime, all kinds of crime, drugs, money laundering, anything you can think of. But in that convention, there is a special protocol. Actually, there are 2. The second one has to do with smuggling, but I'm not going to address that this evening. So the protocol that we're interested in is the protocol to prevent, suppress, and punish trafficking in persons, especially women and children. And it is a protocol of the United Nations Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime. And that's a huge, long title. And very often when we're referring to this particular protocol, we talk about the Palermo Protocol. Why? Because Palermo is in Italy and the protocol was first launched in Palermo in Italy on the 12th of December 2000. So this was a marvelous moment in terms of addressing the issue of human trafficking at the turn of the millennium. And to date, 176 countries have ratified the Palermo Protocol, the protocol to prevent, suppress, and punish trafficking in persons, especially women and children. And you can see the ratifications. I have the link there. This is just a graphic. I think of it in terms of this yellow book because that's how it is in the office. And it's a guide to the UN protocol, at that time to the new UN protocol. And you can read more about this Palermo Protocol on pages 67 to 70 of the Inherent Dignity book that I'm recommending. So I'm actually being very specific about the pages so that you can not feel you have to read a book from beginning to end, that you know where to look in the book. So, and here I use the word Palermo Protocol. So ratification of the Palermo Protocol, and again, I'm going back to repeat the formal name. the protocol to prevent, suppress, and punish trafficking in persons, especially women and children. So my question is, what does it look like in Asia? Who has ratified it and when? And how are the countries ranked? So these are three questions I'm going to attempt to answer and help you to see what the situation is throughout Asia. Of course, then you have to zoom in later in terms of your own country. So 176 countries have ratified and 15 countries have not. And in Asia Pacific, of those 15, Nepal and Pakistan are two that have not yet ratified the Palermo Protocol. So just keep that in mind. And I found it very interesting that in March, when the coronavirus was everywhere and taking hold, that Brunei actually ratified in March 2020. And Bangladesh and Palau last year in 2019. And in my time at the United Nations, I have seen maybe up to 40 countries ratify. So there is ownership happening in terms of this protocol at the global level. But the difficulty is when it comes down to what's happening at the national level. And I'm now going to, I think you're all aware of a trafficking in persons report that is published each year by the US State Department. And I know some of you actually contribute information from your experience on the ground to this report. And I'm asking you to take note of this report because what it tries to do is it tries to rank how well are the various countries implementing the Palermo Protocol. And they do that talking about tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. So let us just look at Asia. When we come to looking at how it's divided, there are actually two regions, East Asia and the Pacific. So what you see colored here. And then the other is South and Central Asia. And here we have India, Pakistan, Nepal, and Sri Lanka. So they're divided in this particular way. So let us go back to East Asia and the Pacific. And the countries in green are in tier 1. I'm not going to name them all out. The countries in yellow are in tier 2. The countries that are in a shade of red are tier 2 with a W, which is they're being watched. And then we have two countries in the region in tier 3. Myanmar is how the UN refers to that country, whereas the US speaks of Burma. So I put in both names there so that if you were looking in the TIP report, that you know where to look. And the dates on the side are when the country actually signed the Palermo Protocol. And I just want you to take note of, in the green section, Taiwan. And it's rated by the US State Department, but it hasn't signed, or it seems here, it hasn't signed the Palermo Protocol. And part of that is the political difficulty with regard to China and Taiwan. And so in terms of the UN, Taiwan does not appear in the literature. But in terms of the US TIP report, it does appear. So that's looking at East Asia and the Pacific. And then going to South and Central Asia, we have no tier 1, we do have tier 2. And Sri Lanka is a tier 2 with a watch. So, you know, we can say, why is that happening? And the next slide will show you that. Um, just a few words about the TIP report. It's a big book with over 500 pages, so don't get scared. Usually the first 50 pages or so are helpful pages because they give you trends, there's nice pictures there, graphics, etc. And in 2019, actually it will be published in June next month, so it would be interesting for you to pick up the new copy and see where your country is. So in 2019, they were looking at challenges and advances with a big emphasis on data collection. And we know that's happening everywhere. Collecting data is important. There was a focus on exploitative sham marriages. There was a section dedicated to prosecution units, highlighting what has been achieved, which is not much, but maybe showing good practice so as to encourage other countries to take a more dedicated approach to prosecutions. Then there was a topic on hotlines, and then leadership and input from human trafficking survivors. So the whole coming to a new place in advocacy are survivors of human trafficking. And so they recognize that. And then there were promising practices with regard to labor. And I think, like, while Good Shepherd might be focusing a lot on trafficking for sexual exploitation, I think you in the Asia region would also be very aware of the whole trafficking in terms of labor for agriculture, into fisheries, etc. So just so that you know that the international coordinator of Talita Kum, and I think there is a regional network of Talita Kum, Gabriella was honored as one of the TIP heroes in 2019. And in some senses, in her being honored, we are all honored because it recognizes the fact that she is heading up in terms of 2,000 Catholic nuns. So the important point here about the TIP report and the ranking of countries, maximum out of that 500 pages, you have 5 pages to read. Find your country. And in 2019, and I think they do it similarly every year, they prioritized the recommendations. So immediately you see what's needed to be done. Then they look at prosecutions, they look at protection, they look at prevention, and then there's a trafficking profile. Now, if you want to understand what's happening in your country from what's written in this book, get out those 5 pages for your country and work your way through it. And I just want to highlight now about national laws. In our advocacy work and in the Palermo Protocol, the whole issue of addressing demand is strong. And it urges governments to criminalize. Human trafficking is a crime. So it's saying, look, you at national level, criminalize the purchase of sexual services. Criminalize the movement of peoples and their exploitation in terms of labor without human rights, without dignity, and in terrible working conditions. Now, with regard to the sexual services, the purchase of sexual services, this model that is being promoted is sometimes called the Nordic model, or more recently, since it took hold in Africa, it's called the equality model. And the countries I have named there are the countries that have adopted this law. And what this law does, and what we're saying is important in terms of our paper, in terms of trafficking of women and girls, focusing on the purchase of sexual services. we're saying that this law that criminalizes anybody who buys sex is the best law. And it contrasts then with laws in countries that legalize prostitution, that say it's okay. And often this is done through the commercial sexual exploitation and in the sex trade, where this is viewed as a job, as work like any other work, and therefore should be subject to labor laws, etc. But we know it's not. So that's one other scenario. And then another is countries that have laws that criminalize prostituted women, but permit the buyer, the purchaser, to go free. So we're saying the best law to have is the one that criminalizes the purchase of sexual services. Now you have a variety, you don't have any of that particular equality model in Asia. Is there opportunities to advocate for it, to talk about it, to have it as part of your discussions, how to proceed? And the key objectives of this equality model is to decriminalize prostituted persons. Because remember, they are the vulnerable one. They have been trafficked because they were vulnerable. And so if they're criminalized, it's another burden on them. So this model says decriminalize. This model says protect, support, and give exit options for prostituted persons. Protect them and support them and help them to move out of prostitution. This model says there should be no impunity for traffickers, pimps, or sex buyers. And this model says the criminalization of the purchase of all sexual acts. Criminalize the purchase. So they're just the key objectives in this particular model. And let me see, am I taking a break here or not? No, I'm going to 2 more slides. The Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, Article 6, on which the 33 pages were written, it says, the Article 6 says, take all appropriate measures, including legislation, to suppress all forms of traffic in women, all forms. So that includes trafficking for labor and sexual exploitation, all forms, and the exploitation of prostituted women. Now, sometimes in the convention, this phrase, the exploitation of prostituted women, that gets lost. And I think it is part of who we are to be addressing this issue. And we know that many, many women are trafficked into prostitution. So making that link. And the general recommendation when it was being written actually took up the United Nations protocol with regard to how do we define trafficking. So before we go into how we define trafficking, I'm going to take a stop and see if there are any questions at this stage.
Thank you, Winifred, for covering up to this stage. So Winifred has taken us through the convention, starting with CEDAW and to the Palermo Protocol. And she also touched on national laws and very interestingly spoke on the Nordic model, or the equality model as we call it now, and how criminalizing the purchases of sex is one of the best ways to address the exploitation of women and children for sexual purposes. So I invite anyone who has a question to unmute your mic, to say your name and to share.
Yes, namaste once again.
And
Yeah, I'm Govinda Bhattarai from Opportunity Village, Nepal. And I just want to update one information from Nepal. Actually, Palermo Protocol was not ratified by the government of Nepal for a long period of time. And we, Opportunity Village Nepal, has been advocating for it along with the one network organization named ETWIN. It is a network organization with 40 organizations working against human trafficking in Nepal. So in March 2020, the government has ratified. Just wanted to update the information that has been shared. So I think it's worth sharing in this platform.
And do you know when they ratified?
I don't know the exact date, but it's in the first or second week of March. It has been.
Okay.
So
okay. Thank you for sharing.
that's a good news to share with you all. In fact,
I will check it again in terms of the ratifications, and I will affirm what you say. So thank you. Anybody else?
Gendry. Fred, I don't have a question, but what's struck me so far, apart from all the very interesting information, is in the earliest first half, we spoke about entitlement. And it seems to me that entitlement creates that demand and power over people. And it's kind of like, it seems to me like that, where is that being addressed, that whole entitlement issue, you know? I guess it's a big question, but I find that seems to be the underlying kind of driver. And it's certainly a cultural thing that we need to address.
I will say yes, yes, and yes. And I suppose much of the gender equality issue, Sustainable Goal 5, is focusing on that. The whole issue with regard to the increase in violence against women during this COVID experience is also part of this male entitlement and male dominance. So I think it begins really in our households, in our communities, to educate men and boys. I think we have a strong focus on educating girls and women, but I think we equally need to focus on boys and men, and to get women and girls and boys and men talking together about it. I won't go any further here, but it is a huge issue.
Thanks, Winifred.
So in the time that is left, I'm going to move into some technical things that, like, I think you need to know if you were, in a sense, writing a report or beginning to do advocacy, to struggle with some of this technical language, etc. But I hope that I will have made it simple for you at the same time. So when we talk about trafficking, there are three elements to it. There's the act, what is done. There's the means, how it's done. And there's the purpose, why it's done. So the act, what is done, the means, how it's done, and the purpose, why it's done. Now, I'm going to move to the next slide because it actually breaks it down. So the act is recruitment, transport, transfer, harboring, receipt of persons, receiving persons. So somebody is out there recruiting, somebody is providing transport, somebody is transferring, someone is harboring, someone is giving a person from one person to another, so receiving persons. So this is the act. Now the means is threat or force of threat, coercion, abduction, fraud, deception, and like those fraud and deception, for example, they're promised education, a good job, a new life. And here we come to the male entitlement and abuse of power. Abuse of power or vulnerability. And the person being trafficked, as we have said, is already vulnerable. And then the abuse of power. And the giving or receiving of payments or benefits. So these are the means. And for what purpose? Exploitation, including the prostitution of others, sexual exploitation, forced labor, slavery or similar practices, the removal of organs, and there can be other types of exploitation. So you're looking at exploitation. So the act, the means, and the purpose. And when you have those three, one aspect from each of those columns, then that's trafficking, and that's a crime. So trafficking happens when one condition from each category is met. One from the act, one from the means, and one from the purpose. So we could take the transfer of somebody, deceiving them, telling them lies, saying you will get them good education, or you'll get them a good job, and they find themselves in a brothel. So that's trafficking. For adults, and this is important, consent is irrelevant if one of the means is employed. So the means here is the middle column. If any one of those is employed and used, it cannot be said the person consented, because we tend to say, oh, well, they were an adult, they knew what they were doing. But they didn't, and therefore they consented. But if any of these means are there, then they have not consented. And for children, consent is irrelevant with or without a means category. So when we come to trafficking of children, there's no even hint of consent being there, that the child wanted to go. So these are important concepts to keep in mind. And what we're after saying is what's contained in the definition in the Palermo Protocol in terms of A and B. Now, I don't think I'm going to go back to read it out again, but all of the words that are here are what we have been talking about in terms of the chart, looking at the act, the means, and the purpose. And then, so that's the definition. And then the law is based on 3 Ps. In 2000, when it was written, they had 3 Ps. In more recent times, more through practice, they're talking about a 4th P. So the Ps are prevention, protection, prosecution, and partnership. And again, I've indicated where you will find this in the position paper. So the 3 Ps, the prosecution part of it is because a crime has been committed. And we can see that in Article 5. I have spoken to you something there about how it's adopted at national level. Now, it doesn't say that all the words that are in the Palermo Protocol have to be written in exactly like that into the national law. But what is important in the national law is that it criminalizes trafficking. That's what we're looking for. So that's the whole notion there of prosecution. And so prosecution, a crime has been committed, the person is charged and they are sentenced. Now there's other aspects with regard to the prosecution aspect, like law enforcement cooperating with one another and exchanging information. There's a whole issue around how train law enforcement to be sensitive to the issue of human trafficking, to women and their vulnerability, girls, children and their vulnerability. And let me add in here, increasingly men are being trafficked and they too are vulnerable. And I think we have to acknowledge that. And on top of their feeling of vulnerability, there is the whole shame associated with they're not male in the sense of this male entitlement. So it's very complex and we need to be very sensitive. There's the whole area of border controls about giving visas and revoking visas, particularly for people who have committed trafficking offences. The whole notion of how are identity documents produced, and getting a state to verify legitimacy of travel documents in another country, etc. So all of this is part of the prosecution. And I name it there because it's important if we're doing advocacy to be aware of this. But generally, it's not our work as such, it's the government work. But sometimes we need to be telling government what they need to do, because you will know that people came in without travel documents, that they were forged, that maybe law enforcement were complicit even in the trafficking. Even government can be complicit. And that's why there can be small number of prosecutions. And there's an emphasis to change that. So again, trafficking has all to do with demand. And we have to criminalize the demand for trafficked persons, whether for sexual exploitation or exploited labor. And this is essential. Traffickers must be prosecuted. Trafficking is a crime. And we know prosecutions in every country are low. And that comes up time and time again. Why aren't there more prosecutions? Moving to prevention. And this is where we do a lot of work, I think, Good Shepherds around the world, and taking up what we mentioned about the state as a duty bearer. So the state as a duty bearer, the person is a rights holder. And if a person has rights, then the state has a duty. So here in red, to alleviate the factors that make persons, especially women and children, vulnerable to trafficking, such as poverty, underdevelopment, lack of opportunity. The state has a duty to do something about these issues. And it's in the protocol, in Article 9. To adopt and strengthen legislation, and to discourage the demand that fosters all forms of exploitation of persons. So this is part of the state's role. Again, we do a lot of work around trying to empower people. But the state has that duty. The state, again, establish comprehensive policies and programs and other measures to prevent and combat trafficking, to protect victims, especially women and children, from re-victimization. So often it's the women who will be arrested, not the trafficker. And to take measures to have research, information, data, have public media campaigns, etc. Develop social and economic initiatives to prevent and combat trafficking in persons. And this in collaboration with non-governmental organizations. So this is somewhere where we come in, and that's part of the partnership. It's not specifically written into the Palermo Protocol, but this is part of it here, the partnership with non-governmental organizations. And addressing, it's just another list, we've said it already, the factors that influence supply: gender inequality, the feminization of poverty, illiteracy, unemployment. Here we're back to the patriarchy, the male dominance, male entitlement. The media and pornography, and the huge use of pornography and of internet to exploit children and women. This is a cutting edge topic and is on everybody's mind. Just last week, there was a study released in the Philippines with regard to technology and child sexual abuse. Then the whole economy, the economic liberalization, trade, all of those things, globalization, war and conflict, transnational crime, and weak law enforcement, all these things are factors that influence supply. So then protection, again, support the victims, support for victims of trafficking. And very often you're engaged in providing safe housing or providing shelter for victims when they are identified. But really, that's a government responsibility. Protecting victims, helping them to bring cases, helping them to get compensation, permitting them to remain in the country into which they were trafficked, helping those that want to return. So there's a whole framework in terms of supporting persons who have been trafficked. And then we're here then into, and I'm going back to empowering survivors, because they often are the best advocates if they have been experienced vulnerability and have been empowered after the experience. They know what is right and how to go about this work. So in addressing human rights issues like trafficking for the purpose of sexual exploitation, individuals as rights holders must be able to participate and be empowered in the process. So just focusing in there in terms of survivors, certainly in Europe and in America, and I think in Asia Pacific too, but I mightn't have the full information, that there are survivors groups and that they are getting engaged in terms of advocacy and trying to highlight the human rights abuses and to ask for what is necessary. I think given where we are time-wise, I might be about to stop, but I'm going to highlight one or two other things that you might want to look at. And the Convention on the Rights of the Child also looks at the sexual exploitation and abuse of children. And the Convention on the Rights of the Child is the most ratified document in the whole world. And guess who has not ratified it? The only country in the light blue there that has not ratified is the United States of America. There's nobody in terms of no action, in terms of orange, the whole world. So it's celebrated as the most widely ratified document. And as I say there, Article 35, you have the mention of sexual exploitation of children. And then that's further elaborated in an optional protocol on the Convention on the Rights of Children to do with the sale of children, child prostitution, and child pornography. And that was launched in the year 2000, almost at the same time as the Palermo Protocol. So again, looking at sexual exploitation of children, removal of organs from children for profit, and the whole aspect of child labor. it's all linked with the goals, the Sustainable Development Goals, in particular 5.2, which references human trafficking, 8.7, which has to do with child labour, and 16.2, which again reference human trafficking. The goals are all interlinked, but these are 3 specific moments in terms of trafficking. And again, it's referenced in the position paper. And advocacy, the big day is the 30th of July. It's the International Day against trafficking in persons. And it's a moment when, like, it's celebrated worldwide, but it might be a time to call your government to action, even around the Sustainable Development Goals. One year we launched this book, Inherent Dignity, on that day. So that's why you see it there, the goals, the blue heart, and the logo for the office. So I'm not going, you can look at the other slides that are there, which are 3 other offices. And I think we're at the stage of maybe thinking, I think Teresa is going to divide you into rooms to have a little chat, and we'll hear what you have to say back in terms of this evening's work. And beyond the thank you, I have done a shortened version highlighting the points that are in the position paper. You may or you may not find it useful, but it's there for you as another way of looking at the position paper. So thank you very much for listening so attentively and being engaged.